As Rumi said, in the existence of your love, I become non-existent. That's the ultimate prayer. So, your question, can awareness pray to itself? It's the same question that we discussed a few days ago. Can awareness direct its attention towards itself? No, it is too close to itself. Can the sun shine on itself? No, it's too close to itself. Awareness cannot direct its attention towards itself. God cannot pray to itself. The sun cannot shine on itself. So this is the higher meaning of the word prayer. In most cases, prayer is considered to be something that the separate self does, that the separate self directs its love towards God. It's not a directing of love towards God, it's a sinking backwards into that love. With a conventional idea of God, and that I devoted myself to that God. But I always found the separate self remained intact. So I was frustrated. Although I couldn't formulate it at the time, I wanted to remain intact as a separate self and to know God. I, the separate self, wanted to know God. It's like a moth wanting to experience the flame. It's like the moth is attracted to the flame, but it wants to touch the flame so that it can experience it. But the moth can never experience the flame, because as soon as it touches the flame, it dies. So it was like that. I was like a moth to a flame. I wanted to experience, I, the separate self, wanted to know God. I wanted to fly into the flame and remain alive. It's not possible. So then I realized that what I was conceiving as God was in fact my very own self, but with a limit attached to it. So this limited self was trying to approach God, but God was shining at the heart of this limited self, but couldn't be clearly seen because of its limitations. And that's when it became clear that in order to know God, one cannot know God, one can only be the Absolute. The I has to either make an investigation called self-inquiry, or it has to surrender itself, which is the equivalent of self-inquiry on the path of devotion. It's either self-abidance or self-surrender. But what is being surrendered, in fact, are all the limitations that the self has acquired, leaving the absolute reality of the self shining, and that is what is called God's infinite being, or infinite consciousness. So the self cannot approach God, because the self is already that for which it is longing, but it cannot know that because of its limitations. It's the beautiful thing Ramana Maharshi said, when the I is divested of the I, only I remains. When the separate self is divested from all its separate qualities, only I, the same self, the self that it always is, remains, but no longer colored by limitations. There is only one I, there is only one self, and that is God's self. The self of each of us is God's infinite being, only limited apparently by thoughts and feelings, which makes God's infinite being appear to be a separate self. that separate self cannot approach God, because that separate self is already the absolute with a self-assumed limit attached to it. So all we can do is surrender those limits. In fact, we don't even need to surrender those limits. We just need to see that those limits don't apply to what we really are. So if we look at what we really are, if we realize I'm not limited by my thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions, at some point this, what we really are, shines as it is. So the essence of prayer is not a movement of the self towards God, but a surrendering of the self into its essence.